great. Now that we've had a chance to make some new friends in this class and get to know each other, I'd like to move on to the second number on our agenda, which is to go over the course content. Before I hand out the syllabus, I'm going to go over the class sort of in a broad, general way, because my experience has been once I hand you the syllabus, you start reading and maybe stop listening. So I'd like to show you the books we're going to be reading and situate them in a timeline. I told you already that this class is great books from the Middle Ages to the Enlightenment. The Middle Ages is roughly the period from around the 18th century to around 1350. Okay? The Enlightenment period is really mid-1600s to mid-1700s. Does anyone happen to know the name of the period between the Middle Ages and the Enlightenment? I'll give you a hint. It translates roughly as rebirth. Yes, Michaela.
Renaissance?
Perfect. Renaissance. Okay, so we're dealing with three literary periods. The works we're going to be reading, we're starting with Beowulf, okay, and that was written in the 10th century. I'm going to abbreviate the titles for now. Okay, so we have Beowulf. It's by an anonymous author, so we don't know who wrote it. The second work we have is Dante's Inferno. Okay, Dante's Inferno he started writing around 1302. It wasn't published until 1323. The next work, one I think we're all familiar with, is Shakespeare's Hamlet. Okay, originally performed in 1603. Then we move on to a work that's quite contemporary with Hamlet, Cervantes' Don Quixote. It's a long one. We're not going to read it all. Don't worry. Okay? Then we leave sort of the literary genre and we go on to a philosophical essay by Descartes, published in 1637. This is called Discourse on Method. And the last work we'll be dealing with is from Jonathan Swift, Gulliver's Travels. Okay, one thing I'd like to point out is that we're dealing with a variety of genres. We have an epic in the poem Beowulf. We have sort of a long narrative poem written in the Italian when we move on to the Inferno. We have drama with Hamlet, one of the first European novels in Don Quixote. Then we have a philosophical essay with Discourse on Method. And Gulliver's Travels is interesting because some people call it a novel, others call it a travel narrative, whereas most critics agree that it's a satire. So it kind of is difficult to classify in terms of genre. I'd like to give a show of hands. Raise your hand if you've read one or more of these texts before. Okay, about half the class. What about Hamlet? Has anyone seen a live production of Hamlet? Wow, you're really lucky. I haven't. That would be great. Well, we'll have to...
The last example is that there are enormous possibilities for plasticity within the individual proteins. So as we talked about earlier, there are proteins in the sodium channels. Sodium channels by themselves are not channels, they're proteins specifically that are in the shape of channels. And then there are proteins like the sodium potassium. There's enormous plasticity within these proteins. So going back to the cocaine example, plasticity is possible from cocaine exposure at the protein level. So we've all learned about alternative splicing. Say due to cocaine exposure, there's some sort of change that causes a genetic change at the change at the genetic level that changes alternative splicing, so a completely new channel is formed. And say, for example, this channel only opens at -50. So you have the same exact effect as you had before. Threshold changes because you have changed the molecular structure. So plasticity can happen both at the threshold level and the level of individual electrical thresholds, and also at the protein level that can alter how often action potentials happen and to what extent they happen in the nervous system. Great. Any questions up until this point? Yes?
So isn't the third protein variability directly linked to changing the overall thresholds? Because how can they change the threshold without changing the protein themselves?
Maybe we'll talk about that more. Yeah. There's a whole mechanism for that. I'm sure we'll work it. Anything else? Great. So, we have talked about how a chemical signal that is received at the dendrites can cause an action potential. But what is that chemical signal in the first place? And you can think of it as sort of like these are the lengths of this is the length of the axon. And these are the terminals of the axon called the axon terminals, right? And they're acting and transmitting the signal to another dendrite. So you can even imagine that there's an axon terminal here that is acting on this dendrite and transferring some sort of chemical signal that causes this particular neuron to fire and transmit the signal to the next neuron.